Hello everybody and welcome to this final series of 2020. We've got some big topic to finish this year with. On one of my videos about international law, Cleo asked these questions and I thought that they would not only provide better context for that series, which skipped over some elemental points like these, but would also make a great standalone video. Cleo has been kind enough to let me use her comment to make this video, so a big thank you to her. I've decided to reconfigure Cleo's comment into 3 basic questions, which I will try to provide 3 concise answers or definitions for. Then though, I will use the specific ideas Cleo raised as talking points from which to further explore these fundamental aspects of British politics and law. The 3 basic questions are: what is the Anglo-British Constitution? What is Anglo-British common law? And what is my opinion on a written constitution for the UK? So let's begin. The Anglo-British Constitution is a composite of laws, constitutional documents, constitutional treaties, institutional protocols and hereditary customs of the Anglo-British that have been inherited from the Anglo-Saxons and evolved throughout history to become the way that Anglo-Brits define themselves and run their society. It is a form of what is often called an unwritten or uncodified constitution. In this video, I'm going to talk about the Anglo-British Constitution and not the United Kingdom Constitution. This is for 2 reasons. The first is that in this video, I want you to really understand the genealogy and nature of the Anglo-British Constitution. And this term assists that because, as you will see, the Anglo-British Constitution is basically the formalisation via institutions of the Anglo-British nation and its values. But secondly, because though this is the constitution that the UK has traditionally used, it has recently taken quite unprecedented damage, certainly in any recent times, such as entry into the EU or the legal transformations conducted by the Blair government. And therefore, frankly, the UK's constitution is currently in a total mess because of this. And I don't want you to get the 2 things, the constitution of the Anglo-Brits and the current mess that has been made of the constitution used by the UK, mixed up with each other, and make what can already be a very complicated topic even more so by bringing in what are distractions and ahistorical acts. Now, the Anglo-British Constitution, as I just defined it, is obviously very different to most other constitutions, and it doesn't match what the common preconception of a constitution is. A constitution is usually a single document or 2 that is used to define a nation or country or regime by a set of foundational values and laws, which dictate the paradigm, the perimeter, within which the society can operate, within which all other ideas or actions must obey. This is colloquially called a written constitution, or more properly, a codified constitution. These constitutions are often written to form or christen the new nation, country or regime. They set out what it will be, and not therefore what it is. As such, these constitutions are the starting point of the political entity that they define. They are the precursor to the entity. They are the most foundational thing. They are the prime mover. This is the opposite of the Anglo-British Constitution. As I said a moment ago, the Anglo-British Constitution is the formalisation via institutions of the Anglo-British nation. It is the product of the nation. By contrast, the codified constitution is typically written to produce a desired, negotiated political entity. Do you see the difference? For the Anglo-British, the nation is fundamental, the nation is the prime mover, and the constitution is the result or the outcome of this. And by contrast, in the codified constitution, the constitution itself is foundational and prime mover. Obviously, I'm having to generalise about codified constitutions. They vary across all of the different countries, although a lot of them are very similar. But just for expediency, I'll make this generalisation. Understanding that the Anglo-British Constitution is simply the institutionalisation of the nation and its values, and not the foundation itself, will be the key idea that I'd like you to take away from this video. If we go right back to the origin, the English nation existed before the country of England. The nation came first, and the nation was foundational. Don't get overexcited by this talk of nation and nationalism. It's simply a historical fact that the English existed before England. When Alfred the Great and his successors began their reconquest of the Anglo-Saxon kingdoms from the Vikings, they did it by rallying all of the Anglo-Saxon peoples on the basis that they were the same, that they were English. And by becoming a nation, the English were able to unify and organise in a way that the Vikings, still operating as private kingdoms or warlords, were not. Thus the Viking kingdoms were destroyed, And in the place of the old Anglo-Saxon kingdoms, a new kingdom was made, England. And in order to form England, the English simply took their English values and culture, their nationalism, so to speak, and made them the values and culture of England. Thus, insomuch as we can talk of it, England at this time had a constitution that was more or less entirely synonymous with the society of the English. And the most primordial of England's constitutional documents were the royal charters issued by monarchs, which basically wrote out that society or some part of that society in words, the values and culture of the English. Remember that there wasn't the same sort of written tradition in the Anglo-Saxons or for the English that there was in the classical world. And so whereas traditionally Rome or Greece had a very strong intellectual tradition, the Anglo-Saxons had a very strong political tradition. Their society was a lived society. Their politics, their ideas were lived. They were oral, they were practical, and thus writing them down came later. Now, obviously, once the English constitution began to take a more formal existence, then a cycle was created in which the nation fed the constitution, and the constitution in turn fed the nation, and so on. And this is good because the two, the nation and the state, if you like, end up reinforcing each other. I think this is one of the major reasons why the English and Anglo-British political entity is one of the oldest in existence, especially important given the particular changes and problems that have gone on in Europe. This natural and congenial union between the nation and state is incredibly rare in history and in countries. In other political entities, the two, the nation and the state, or the individual and the society, are often seen as adversaries. Indeed, in most of the countries with their codified constitution, the constitution is really just a document made by a few people and in a very specific, often highly jubilant or desperate circumstance. And this document is being applied to everybody else in perpetuity. The result of this is that the political entity it creates, the society, is somewhat artificial. It's held together by the rule of will, the will of those who made the codified constitution. And the nation and the state, or the nation and the constitution, they don't feed each other, but instead the nation is simply controlled by the state or constitution. This is another reason why I think codified constitutions are 10 a penny, and why these constitutions or regimes or nations frequently fail as formal entities. Because simply put, times change and people get sick of being told what to do by a limited set of ideas made by a small number of people from 3 or 2 or even 100 years ago. Now, this is all a lot to take in, and I will come back to the history and technical details later when I discuss common law. What I want to do now in this video is look more at the nature of the Anglo-British Constitution and try to explain what it is and why it works. I've already given you the basic overview of this, but I now want to provide several perspectives to approach this from multiple angles, and hopefully one of these angles will be intelligible for you, and even more hopefully together they will make a comprehensible 3D image for you. If we think of the Anglo-British Constitution as a solid object, a set thing like the Constitution of the USA, we will miss it entirely. Earlier I gave you, therefore, a very literal definition of the Anglo-British Constitution. I said it was a composite of laws, constitutional documents, constitutional treaties, institutional protocols, and hereditary customs of the Anglo-British. Yet implicit in that is the idea that therefore the Constitution will change, since these constituent parts of it change. And if they and it change, then it must be by some method, some set of values, otherwise it would be changing chaotically and become dysfunctional. My point is that the Constitution of the Anglo-British is really the set of values of the Anglo-British nation, a set of values that are inherently political in nature, that represent forms of political empiricism, political induction, and political justice or stability, and that therefore these make up a methodology and not a dogma, and that these values have been institutionalized so that they form a more rigorous methodology than if they were not institutionalized, and therefore that this methodology is really what the Constitution of the Anglo-British is. It's the thing that never changes and determines how Anglo-British society is run. Therefore, at any single moment, what we see as that composite is not really the Constitution itself, but the outcome of it, a snapshot. It is the result of the innumerable workings of the society running on this constitution, on this methodology, that together form the most up-to-date picture that the Anglo-Brits declare to be the most reliable, accurate and practical form of society. If you saw my series on international law, you'll hopefully see that the codified type of constitution is therefore not inductive like the Anglo-British, but deductive. It sets a series of premises which are applied top-down to society and all other matters, in the hope that if the Constitution's premises are correct, then all other matters will be correctly adjudicated by them. I'll explain this process of institutionalisation later when I discuss English common law. But for now, just know that the Anglo-British Constitution develops like an evolutionary tree, branching out from a sequential institutionalising of the nation, and both, funnily enough, centralising and delegating authority to and from the monarchy, which of course is the original institution around which the nation was centred and the formal constitution developed. Now, as I've already referenced, with all this scary talk of nation and nationalism, it's no wonder that people tend not to know much about or understand the Anglo-British Constitution and why it has been so easily gutted in the UK recently, since the very history, the very ideas needed to understand it is currently considered evil and in need of suppression. And what's more, it's also conceptually harder, as I think you can probably see by my explanation, to think of a constitution when it is a methodology rather than a fixed tablet of stone with assertions on it. But if you're still with me, let me provide two analogies that I hope will make things clearer. Right now, at this exact moment, the Anglo-British Constitution takes the form of a particular set of premises and protocols, much like a codified constitution. But watch yesterday and tomorrow, and 100 years from now, the codified constitution will still be exactly the same, still that same single document of premises. The Anglo-British one will have been updated. Like an evolutionary animal, like a species, its current momentary form is the result of its genealogy, its history, and via natural selection. And yet, because of this process, it will continue to evolve in line with its genetics, but adapting to changing circumstances and facts. Will both evolutionary animals and the Anglo-British Constitution work on this same idea, this same premise of genetics or precedent, and adapting to changing or new circumstances? And both survive because of this. A second analogy. The Anglo-British Constitution is entirely synonymous and works exactly like modern science. It is the political equivalent of modern science. At any one time, there is a particular body of scientific knowledge, and this knowledge is derived via the modern scientific method. Now, what's more important? What is more fundamental and useful? In fact, what makes that knowledge reliable? Is it the body of knowledge itself, or the method that produced it? Well, in a few decades, that body of knowledge will have changed. And it will have changed because the scientific method continues to operate, and thus learn, and thus update the knowledge. Therefore, it is the scientific method that is truly useful and which is truly valued, and not the contemporary set of knowledge derived it. The knowledge itself is just the latest expression of the method, but it is the method that a scientist should live by, otherwise they're turning that knowledge into dogma. Hopefully this analogy was fairly self-explanatory. The Anglo-British Constitution, that institutionalising of the Anglo-British nation, is the same as that of the modern scientific method. And it is no coincidence that both are based on a set of very similar values, if not really the same values, that make them effective. If you remember, I spoke about how the Anglo-British used induction to form the Constitution, and then the Constitution fed back into the nation, and the cycle continued. Well, the modern scientific method does essentially the same thing. It observes a phenomenon, it makes a hypothesis, a guess, about why this happens. It then creates an experiment to test this, and it produces a result. And this result is then used to form the basis of a new hypothesis, a new prediction or guess, and thus a new experiment, and the cycle continues indefinitely, producing increasingly reliable knowledge. Well, the Anglo-British Constitution has as its experiments real life, real legal cases, real politics, real technological changes, and via applying its methodology to innumerable examples, it slowly evolves, producing an ever more reliably functioning society. And like the scientific method, it continues to survive and to be used not because of force or oppression, but because it works. Now, if your idea of society is one that brings about utopia, or implements some particular ideology, or personally satisfies you, then the Anglo-British Constitution is not for you. Because of its empirical, inductive, and justice base, it is a way of running society that naturally aligns with reality, with the world, with human nature, and the specific cultural nature of the people in the society, and thus it generates a society that is stable and lasts. And it has to be both internally cohesive and externally robust and realistic, and too often do people emphasise one over the other. In England and Britain, we see that for genealogical reasons, this takes the specific form of a pragmatic partnership between society as a whole and the individual, which ultimately produces the idea of a nation unified by common, just law. Hence, English society develops in a way that is practical and not based upon idealism, something that has always driven idealists and ideologues crazy. For example, it is a strong central government, but that is accountable and subject to the law. It is a concept of political liberty instead of Lutheran ego liberty, which balances one's public duty with one's personal human life. This personal life is guaranteed by private property, which is itself balanced by the existence of everyone else's private property, alongside their personal life and their public duty. We can go on in this vein, for example the way that the Anglo-British Constitution allows for a state church, a state religion, or the way that it is based upon the nation, or the way that it supports a hereditary monarchy, and yet despite all this, under that constitution, the greatest liberty, the greatest tolerance. And this is because the constitution is not the creation of certain people's limited thinking. And so it doesn't pigeonhole ideas or rest upon lazy, abstract political logic. All this really amounts to is the fact that if a society is going to be held together by anything other than force or will, then it has to be naturally cohesive, and thus it has to have some self-awareness of itself, and some balance between the society as a whole and the individuals that make it up. This is fundamental to human beings. We are both naturally social animals and yet inescapably individual psyches. And because of its values, the Anglo-British and their constitution end up building upon this to generate a society that is neither tyrannical nor anarchic, where the individual has a private life and a public duty, where empirical reality, shared by all, is the basis of society and societal discourse, and where each person has a historic right to demonstrate their own soul, so to speak, and yet where the nation is rightly accepted as a transcendent wealth that is bigger and wiser than the individual. And yet that same nation exists the way it does because it recognises that it is the result of every individual's own life. Earlier on, I compared the intellectual tradition of, say, Greece with the political tradition of the Anglo-British, and I think that much as we define ancient Greek, or certainly ancient Athenian identity, by its intellectual methodology and spirit, so too the English and Anglo-British are defined by their politics, by their political methodology and spirit. In fact, I have a strong suspicion that the reason these two groups have such an enormous impact upon the world is because they're more or less doing the same sort of thing but in those different realms, the Greeks intellectually and the Anglo-Brits politically. The ancient Greeks are in a discourse to discover what the most reliable intellectual ideas are, and the Anglo-Brits are in a discourse to work out how to make the most reliable, sustainable kind of society. For example, I pointed out in the series on international law that in Greece you get an intellectual method known as the Socratic method for intellectual inquiry, and in England you get an oppositional parliament designed to do the same thing for political inquiry. If you find this topic interesting, I strongly recommend re-watching this video because what I've done is offer several different ways of looking at the Anglo-British Constitution in the hopes that it gives you that well-rounded understanding of it. If you think of the way that the Gospels in the Bible all cover the same thing, the life of Jesus, but they do it in different ways, and together that way they give you a better understanding of what's going on, I've tried to do the same sort of thing with my various analogies here. Not that I can compare the two works, of course, but as the Anglo-British Constitution is multifaceted, I've tried to offer an account that itself is multifaceted. I highly recommend using the holiday to read about it further. It will pay dividends for you if you give it just a little bit of time. In the next part of this series, we're going to look at Magna Carta and the Bill of Rights and ask what these documents are in the Constitution and how these seemingly codified documents could fit into an uncodified constitution.